summer heat is finally starting to relent. It has been getting a lot cooler these past few days, especially up here in Tohoku. And one of the things that we enjoy doing in the summer, because the summer heat can be obnoxious, is that we like to tell ghost stories because it kind of gives us a chill just going up our spine and it cools us off. And that was something I never thought about until I moved to Japan. And it is very common for people to do things or tell ghost stories or whatever during the summer months to kind of give them a chill. It scares them so they get a nice bodily chill and it cools them down. Um, but there's more things than just telling stories. Some people will have these, um, what do they call them? The moments of courage or something along those lines. I forget what they call them, but they will basically go to a haunted spot and uh, see if there's actually any evidence of spirits or the supernatural or whatever. And so that is a typical activity that a lot of people do for the summertime. And I myself, I love horror movies. I like horror stories, and this can be an all year round thing for me. And I think that's what attracted me to this dilapidated, old rundown house in this forgotten village that God knows whenever whoever saw the last person was here. And I'm quite sure this place is haunted. If not, it's really convincing otherwise. Um, this house where you hear a floorboard creak, and that either could be the wind or some vengeful spirit lurking around the corner. Can't be too sure which one. And like it gives this place this charm, along with this old radio that I've been able to use since I started this. And I don't know how it still functions, but this thing is circa World War II. And so oftentimes I will tell you about things that are lurking in the dark nearby, whether they're watching me with malicious intent or just curiosity. But today, the ghosts seem to be taking a day off. And I don't really care either way. If they're here, it keeps me company. But today, I'm going to talk about the ghosts of another place. Something that's a little bit more real. Well, real is a matter of, is not, is, it's more of a subjective thing. But one of the places in Tokyo, called Ikebukuro, there is this place called Sunshine City. And I'm sure if you say that several times fast, you will mess up. I almost messed up right there. And so, Sunshine City. I have not been there yet. These are only stories I have heard. I've been to Ikebukuro, but that was only for going to a Kamen Rider Super Sentai restaurant. But had I known about this story at that moment, I would have gone. But Sunshine City in Ikebukuro, uh, typical shopping area, very busy, full of life, both natural and supernatural. And you may be wondering, what could be haunting this shopping center and this place that has like an aquarium and cafes and families running around. So, what kind of spirits could be haunting such a place? Well, this place was built on the grounds of an old prison. And this prison isn't some ordinary prison. This prison became rather infamous. So, if you know anything about Japanese history, you may have heard about Sugamo Prison. And that is the place where Japan's most notorious war criminals were held and eventually executed after World War II. And several men were hung there, or hanged. Is it hanged or hung? I don't know how I'm an English teacher when I do that. Anyway, they met the end of their life dancing at the end of a rope. Let's put it that way. And one of those men was Hideki Tojo. And he is basically the face of Japan during the war. Germany was Hitler, Italy was Mussolini, Japan was Tojo. But Tojo was not he was not the emperor. He was not in charge. Okay? So he was the wartime prime minister and he held various other positions as well, but he was nasty. Um, so you got Tojo, you got the general Iwane Matsui, and he oversaw the Nanjing massacre. And if you know anything about World War II history, particularly Japanese wartime atrocities, you know this event, and this one's a big one. And they were all at Sugamo Prison, and when that place was demolished, they built Sunshine City over top of it. And people say that they can still hear these prisoners talking. So, like, imagine that you're standing in line at one of the cafes, and then you just beneath your feet are the it's the area that where people held the people who plunged Asia into war. It's where they were held, and then they were dropped through the gallows. I am also drinking Asahi beer tonight. Um, they have Blackpink on the can, so they're doing some sort of collaboration. So that's how you market. You get a bunch of cute Asian girls on the can, and you can be damn sure I'm going to buy that. Just don't tell my wife that. So you'll probably hear me drinking that throughout this podcast. So people, they hear talking. They hear there's stories of strange feelings, like in elevators in these cramped spaces. You got whispers in the halls at night from security. These are reports from security guards, um, and maybe even the occasional shadow that doesn't match its surroundings. So, they say that you could say that Sunshine City is bright on the outside, but haunted underneath. And you can probably guess that's where I'm going to lead into, as today's topic is Japan's Pacific War, or the war in Asia, the Pacific theater of World War II. And for a lot of Americans, for America, I should say, for America, World War II did not start until 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. But for Japan, they had been going at it for a lot longer than that. So let's jump back further. So you have China, Japan, and Korea. This is when Korea was unified. It was a full country by itself. And it had been targeted by Japan several times over the centuries. If you have seen the zombie series The Kingdom, or is it Kingdom? Uh, that story plays into how a very low number of Koreans were able to defeat a large Japanese army. And basically, that's how the zombies were created. So, spoilers, by the way. Uh, so, jumping back, Korea and Japan were kind of always at odds with each other long before World War II. And you have the furthest I'll go, just to kind of keep it within the realm of things here, is you have the assassination of Empress Myeongsong, and this was in 1895, and so you have that, and people were just saying it, for decades, people were saying that was just a Japanese thing. Recently, it turned out there were Korean co-conspirators there, so she was assassinated by both her own people and the Japanese. Um, and then about 15 years later, let's see, 1910, they annexed Korea and turned it into a they turned it into a puppet state, um, where basically they Korea was becoming Japan minor, essentially. Like they were outlawing the Korean language. They were preventing people from, naming their children uh, Korean names. Um, so this is where kind of things just really blast off for what Japan had done to Korea. Um, so so basically, they've taken control of Korea, and it's almost like its new prefecture, essentially. Um, and then, so that's 1910. And then in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and they took over that area. And then you have Japan invading proper China, the mainland, China proper, I guess I should say it that way, in 1937. Um, and then while they were doing this, they were doing it under the idea of keeping Western influences out. This is a kind of a common idea, as there were a lot of European colonies in Asia. France, the UK, Germany, they all had their hands in Asia one way or another. Um, and actually, during World War One, when Japan was fighting with the Allies, they took over the islands that Germany had taken over. So they took those from Germany during the war. Um, and then, so now after the war, things are really heating up in the East, and Japan's kind of taken over everything. Japan's not a resource-heavy country, so they needed resources that other neighboring countries had, but they were doing it under the pretense of this greater East Asian sphere, this keeping the Western powers out. Like this is going to be an all Asian territory. We don't want the Europeans. We don't want the Westerners here. And that was their. That was what they were saying it was. They said it was both, mainly liberation, but no, it was domination. Let's be real here. And like I had learned about this, years ago when I was studying about Japanese history, and the real nitty gritty stuff that you don't really learn in high school. This is the type of stuff that either you learn in a Asian history class that's specifically on this sort of thing, But Asia's got a lot of history, so it really you have to narrow it down. Um, or you just kind of read the stuff on your own because you're interested in Japanese history, or even Chinese or Korean history, or Asian history as a whole. This shaped Asia for today, and that's what I love about history. History is my favorite subject. So so I learned about a lot of this stuff on my own, and when I came to Japan, I the way that Japan teaches World War II history is rather infamous because they don't get into the details of it. They talk about the big events, Pearl Harbor, the atomic bombs, of course, but they don't spend a lot of details into a lot of the battles, like say we would in the States. But they really kind of avoid what had happened in China and in Korea and stuff like that. They briefly mention it, but not to a great degree. And that's angered China and Korea, which I think is rather interesting considering both China and Korea have government uh, controlled textbooks for their schools, and they don't teach about their own atrocities, but they demand Japan to teach its own atrocities, and textbooks in Japan are published by private companies. So, and the Ministry of Education will choose the textbooks they want. So, at any given time, you may have more or less information about that time period. It just depends on the textbook of that they choose. Um, as of right now, the last time I checked, it's briefly mentioned, but not in great detail. So, and I may, if I remember, I may get more into that later, but I want to kind of keep it focused on the timeline itself at the moment. So, 1937, you got Japan just dominating China. They invade China and they just blow through. I mean, China's already in the middle of its own civil war, so they're not even really fighting necessarily on a united front. Uh, they're doing what they can, but it's not enough. I think if China was unified by that point, it may have put up a better fight, but it's kind of hard to tell at that point. Um, so, so 1937, December, uh, Japan comes into the capital Nanjing. That was the capital at the time, and so Nanjing, you have the Nanjing massacre. Um, one book I do recommend, and if you know anything about history in this era, you probably already know what book I'm about to mention, as it's rather famous, is the Rape of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanking. Um, I don't know. I never know which one's the best proper term. Is it Nanking or Nanjing? I switch between the two. Um, so, the Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang, and she was an American um, from California who had done extensive research and even visited Nanking for this. And there's even a statue of her in Nanking at the museum, which I really do want to go to one day. Um, but uh, this book really affected her, and if you've read the book, you know why. Because the details of this book is incredibly dark. I'm not going to go into every little thing that the Japanese have done just because of the way I want to do this podcast. But you do have the infamous um, beheading race that two soldiers were doing. They were using katanas to, behead people, and they were having a race for it. And um, and then you you they had their way with the women, um, and, and these poor women, like multiple times a day, and some of them died from disease, exhaustion, whatever have you, and You could even consider that to be a mercy for them, but they it was brutal to say the least, and that even doesn't do it justice compared. Once you hear what they have actually done in this or this city, like, it's no words. And even as someone who I love Japan, I think Japan is a wonderful country. Um, it's got a lot of great history to it, but it definitely has its dark history moments, and I do think that this is one of those things that needs to be taught to everybody. Even in America, the Pacific War is not taught to a great degree. There's a lot of focus on the European theater, and so a lot of Americans generally are ignorant of a lot of the details of the Pacific War. And so when you hear about how brutal the Japanese army, the navy, actually were, it's people are surprised by that. And when you learn about Nanking, it's it leaves you speechless. And I'm trying to find the words to keep this relatively kid friendly. Um, but you have what they did to the women, and it gets even worse, more than just the rapes. You like I'm at a loss of words when it comes to this sort of thing. Um, if I was focusing this thing on for adults, then I definitely would be a little bit more uh, detailed with it. Um, but they there was a safe zone in Nanking that the Japanese didn't honor. They did on the surface, but they would jump over the walls of this uh, makeshift safe zone and have their way with the women. You which the ironic thing is that the so World War II as a whole had some really interesting players. So in um, uh, in Nanking, you have the Nazi ambassador John Robb, who he was a Nazi, but he stood against the Japanese, who were the allies of Germany, uh, saying, "Hey, you know, this is not right. You shouldn't be doing this, and we will protect anyone we can." And then you have Sugihara Chiune in Lithuania helping Jews. Like, he's helping Jews escape the Holocaust. So it's very interesting that you have players such as these two characters who are allies, but they are helping the victims the victims of their allies escape these horrors when even their own people were doing these terrible things. Now, granted, John Robb, this is 1937, so um, the Holocaust really hadn't started up by then yet, as of that moment. So anyway, um, so you got mass killings. Estimates of the 6 week horror is 200,000 to 300,000. Some people say it's a little high. Some people say that it's a little lower. There is a big gap in the estimates just because a lot of bodies, just weren't accounted for. A lot of that you had people who had entered the city, um, escaping the Japanese, and they just happened to die there. So there's a lot of reasons why the number fluctuates. But I'm generally on the on that scale of 200 to 300,000 people. Um, so and you have General Iwane Matsui. He's running the thing. You have Prince Asaka, who was also in charge of things. He was not executed by the war's end because he was given amnesty as he was part of the royal family. And he lived out his days and then later died. I think in his 80s, he moved to Atami City, and I think that's where he ended up dying, dying of old age. Um, so you have that bit going on in Asia, and then a few years later, you have Pearl Harbor in '41, um, and this this event, obviously it brought America into the war. We were staying out of things, aside from kind of sending supplies over to England, but um, that was the most contributions we were doing at the time. And then Japan bombs us in Pearl Harbor, and then we get pulled into it. And then this is stuff that you is pretty basic knowledge. Um, but at that same time, Japan was also launching attacks on American bases in the Philippines and Guam and everything, basically all across Southeast Asia. Um, so they were doing all of these attacks at once, and Japan was hoping that they would cripple the Pacific Fleet, but as luck would have it, the aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor at the time. So they were out doing something else, and they missed out on the bombing, and so that helped us tremendously. So uh, so you have all that going on, and this is where I think that kind of luck plays into things because, or not luck, I'm sorry, how things happen for a reason. That's what I meant to say. Because you have the most powerful ships, the aircraft carriers. They're not in Pearl Harbor when they should have been, according to Japanese intel. But they were gone during the bombing, and they, were vital in winning the war. And Japan knew this because they relied on their own aircraft carriers. And during the Battle of Midway, which was in 42, early 42, they lost four of those carriers at the Battle of Midway. And if you're a Star Trek fan, one of the American carriers was called Enterprise. So I always find it, there's almost a sense of pride whenever I hear like, Enterprise was involved in fighting in the war. So anyway, so you have America fighting back, but it's not an easy victory because the Japanese, they were ruthless as hell. Didn't give up, bonsai charges all the time. And like you have the Marines landing at Guadalcanal, and they were dealing with these bonsai charges all the time. And you had suicide bombers, uh, not in like the sense like that we think of them today, but rather like these types of bombers, like um, they would hold. It's basically a single grenade, and these with the pineapple grenades. They look like a pineapple, and they're easy to conceal. And you would have a Japanese soldier playing in, acting hurt, and a Marine corpsman would come over and they would, detonate the grenade and take out as many people as they could. Um, that was their style, and medics were a target for them. They didn't care. So you will have medics uh, getting rid of their insignias, their symbols. Like they would put on normal helmets while medics would typically have the red cross on their helmets. That's a bullseye for the Japanese. Um, so so you have all of this. You have the MacArthur island hopping campaign going from Guadalcanal, basically on Australia's doorstep, going all through Southeast Asia. Uh, going from like Guadalcanal, you got Peleliu, you got all of these islands that they get to, And there are some islands that where there were some brutal battles, but they did not ultimately mean much. Yeah, there might be an airfield on it or something, but they sometimes they didn't end up using the airfield. Um, so they went 3 years. So yeah, 42, beginning of 42, all the way to basically the atomic bombs. Um, so a little over 3 years of these island hopping campaigns going all the way up to Okinawa. And Okinawa was nasty if there ever was anything. And it's the last giant great battle. And I don't mean great as in that was a good battle. I mean great as in it was big, big, bloody, and ruthless as hell. But some interesting stories come out of Okinawa, such as you have Desmond Doss, the the um, the medic who didn't carry a gun, and he saved. He says roughly around 75 men in one night, but people are estimating it to be much higher than that. Um, so you have that story going on at Hacksaw Ridge, and then you have, and that's in the middle of the island. So I traveled a few years ago to Okinawa, and I found Hacksaw Ridge, and it was surreal to stand on that that area, that mountain, and just trying to imagine the war going on. So that's up in in the middle of the island around Naha, and then down in Itoman, which is the southern tip of the island, um, you have the Himayuri, and those were schoolgirls who, middle school, high school aged, who were basically drafted by the Japanese and into helping with the war effort, being nurses or supply runners and everything. And to leave this part short, a lot of them were killed, whether it was due to crossfire, getting caught in the crossfire, or by their own hand when the Americans were advancing, um, believing the Japanese propaganda that terrible things would happen to them. Basically, the same terrible things that the Japanese had actually done in China. Um, so, so yeah, like I enjoy going to these war sites, and Okinawa is just one big war site. The whole island's a battleground. Um, but like in Tokyo, even Tokyo, when I go there, a lot of people don't talk about the fire bombings, and the fire bombings killed more people than the atomic bombs did. Um, and so there are moments like where I'm standing in a particular spot of Tokyo or something, and I'm trying to imagine it just being leveled because of the fire bombs. And so it's again, this isn't really taught in the Japanese textbooks, but it's not much taught in the American ones either, because they don't talk about the Pacific Theater very much. Um, but I really wish people would talk more about the war crimes themselves, and like particularly Nanking, because you got this city, and like if you've read The Rape of Nanking, you understand completely. And like I went back through the book before I went through this podcast, just to kind of get a refresher on some of the stuff and just some minor details, but in case I was wanting to bring them up, but I don't think I will. But like you have some of the lesser known things, I guess I'll mention is they didn't just murder people, they toyed with them before murdering them. And you have the literal rapes that went on, you have the beheading race, you have when they were looking for soldiers, because there were soldiers were um, they were leaving their post. I'm losing track of the word that I want to use right now, but they were abandoning their post essentially. hiding amongst the civilians, and the Japanese were looking for soldiers, and they would check the hands, looking for calluses. And you don't need to be a soldier to have calluses on your hands, and so, but that didn't matter. So they were taking anybody that had calluses on their hands. So you could have been a farmer, and you're getting taken out and shot and dumped into the Yangtze River. And so you got this whole river turning red with blood because of this stuff. Um, and so you have that going on, and you have you have the Japanese forcing families to do things together. Fathers and daughters, mothers and sons. I don't see the point in that, but they did it. Uh, Bamboo spears on women in particular. You can probably guess the location they used for that. Um, Again, I'm trying to keep it relatively easy on the ears and not be so graphic. But if I could, basically, you had this city, a city of lanterns turned into a city of corpses. While that does sound poetic, that is quite literal too. So, yeah, I do recommend reading The Rape of Nanking if you want to learn about more about that topic. It's a hell of a book, and but don't try and read it in one go. It's not a long book, but don't try and read it in one go because it'll make you depressed. Pace yourself with it. Um, but that's one of the things that's constantly shoved back in Japan's face is that, and I understand why. I get it. And Japan and or China and Korea are demanding apologies for the war crimes committed by the Japanese, such as Nanking, and you got the comfort women in Korea. Um, and if you don't know what a comfort woman is, I mean, it kind of is self-explanatory, but it is a woman who is doing sexual favors for the Japanese soldier, to put it lightly, um, whether what they wanted to or not. Uh, so so that was a thing in going on as well, and there are statues honoring these women who endured this terror. Uh, and there are some of them that are still alive even now, and uh, it was a very terrible thing, and so Japan has not been so forthcoming, with this type of info, and they like to avoid it. I get it. I understand why, but at the same time, at least teach the material to students. Now, of course, there's a time and place for it. You don't need to unload this type of material on the like elementary school kids, but you kind of ease it into the curriculum with high school. I don't know if I would even go into junior high school with this stuff. Maybe briefly mention it at the very least, but this would be more university level type stuff. And so my whole one of my issues with this is China and Korea, they do not let this go. And they kind of bring it up any chance they get, and I get it. And they're demanding apologies, but what would an apology actually do? Would China and Korea actually accept an apology, or would they just assume that China, or would they just assume that Japan is being, insincere with it, just to shut them up? Like, I'm not trying to sound inconsiderate for the horrors that the people of those countries face. I cannot imagine it myself because I have lived a pretty good life, not in a war torn country or a war torn era. But there are, you have to kind of look at the bigger picture. Is that would an apology actually do anything? And I don't think it would. I think there's other things that they could do to kind of ease relations a bit, when talking about this topic. But I don't think an apology would necessarily work because there have been Japanese politicians that have apologized for it, and it's gone ignored. And you do get these hardcore, uh, conservative type uh, politicians in Japan who flat out ignore it. Uh, and so there's a lot of focus that goes on them rather than the ones who do admit that it happened. Um, and I have several friends who are history teachers, and they want to teach this stuff. And so, it's a very delicate topic over here in the East, and you kind of you kind of wish that they would kind of not let it go, but get settle things. Um, so this leads into so you okay. So the war continues. I know I'm bouncing everywhere around here. I'm kind of because I'm talking into this microphone and I'm waiting for it to cut out, considering it's World War II era. Uh, but so I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head about this, obviously. And so you got the fire bombings in Tokyo, which killed more than the atomic bombs, and then you have the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's world famous, of course. Um, Japan is the only country in the world to have been hit with an atomic bomb during wartime. There's other places that had detonated atomic bombs just for practice, but it's never been used as an aggression, except for that, so except for Japan. Um, and that in itself is considered. Some people would even say that that's a war crime, and America needs to be held responsible for that. However, I disagree with this, not just because I'm an American, um, but because I understand history, and people have this really black and white thing of when it comes to history that if you erase something from history, it nothing changes. That is not true, not in the slightest. Like if you've watched any time traveling movies, of course, time travel does well that we know of doesn't exist, and it's all just science fiction. Um, but going on the theory of time travel, if you change something in the past, the future is affected. So if you look at things like Back to the Future, there were minor and major changes in the timeline. Um, Same thing with Star Trek. That's been the topic of many episodes. Of course, I always love a time travel story. Those are always fun. I'm actually writing a time travel series myself. And so when you look at the atomic bombs and you take them out of the equation, what do you think would have happened if there were no atomic bombs? Like, the war would eventually end, but it would not end, in 1945. It would have gone on at least another year because, yeah, Japan would not have won the war, but it would have died trying, and the death count would have been even higher, not just with soldiers, but with civilians alike. Because if you look at what happened down in Okinawa, they would have done the same thing on the mainland. So so you have Operation Downfall, which is the American landings, the invasion of mainland Japan, uh, and so Operation Downfall was divided into two smaller operations. You have Operation Olympic, which was going into Kagoshima, which is on the southern tip of Kyushu, and then you have um, Operation Coronet, which was going uh, into Chiba. So you have these two going, and Chiba's in the middle of the Honshu Island. The Honshu is the biggest island. um, and it's just east of Tokyo. So, so let's say this goes down. You have the atomic bombs. They're not dropped for whatever reason. You could have had, um, the something, a mishap at for um, the planning of the bombing, the planning of the bombs, or there's something going on with the practice runs, like it's just nothing's working, or it could even be that the USS Indianapolis was sunk before it reached Tinian, because the Indianapolis was on a secret mission delivering parts of the atomic bomb to Tinian, and it was on its way back when it was sunk, which is um, it was sunk by a Japanese submarine, and a lot of people survived the sinking, but a lot of them didn't make it out of the water, as it is the largest shark attack on humans in history. Um, but those weren't great whites; those were actually oceanic white tip sharks. So if you watch what I forget, is it called the Indianapolis? Is that the name of the movie? I think it's with Nicolas Cage. Yeah, there's one with great where the sharks are great whites. That's not true. They're oceanic white tips. So, um, so yeah, that's they were on a secret mission, radio silence. They were not. No one was going to save them because no one knew they were even overdue. So that could be a reason why that there's no atomic bombs. But whatever, you take them out of the equation. Now you have Operation Downfall, where you have soldiers entering Kyushu and Honshu, going into Kagoshima and Chiba. And now you got ground fighting in mainland Japan, one of which is very close to Tokyo. And now the body counts are stacking up. And now you have the Soviets, who are just manhandling the Japanese at this point too. Like, they've officially declared war on Japan at this point. Better late than never, I guess. And they are just putting it to them in Manchuria. So the Japanese are getting their tails kicked in by Stalin's troops in Manchuria, and so the Soviets are making their way, and they would eventually invade through Hokkaido, which is the northern island, and even maybe even the northern part of Honshu up around in Tohoku, like Akita or Yamagata, basically coming across the Sea of Japan. So they're going to have these invasion forces just coming in, and you would have all these battles going on everywhere, and Japan would ultimately lose, of course, but the death toll would be obnoxiously high, both soldiers and civilians. Civilians, defending their homes from the invaders, killing themselves because they don't want to know, they don't want to go through what they've been told what would happen to them, um, things like that. Um, and so you have all of that going on with that because you didn't drop the atomic bombs. And so maybe the war lasts until 1946, give or take. And uh, so then, what else do you think happens here? So you got Japan having lost the war, and they are now a country occupied by Americans and Soviets. And basically, you're going to have a split Japan, between North and South, almost like, basically like Germany. And Tokyo will be split in half, like Berlin was, and there would even be a Tokyo Wall eventually, just like there was a Berlin Wall. And as for the emperor, that would depend on who found him first. If the emperor was found by the Americans, chances are we wouldn't have done anything to him. We would have kept them safe and hidden, and basically how we had it in this timeline. With what MacArthur suggested, like, keep this guy as a figurehead, but he doesn't have any power. Same thing here. Uh, so the royal family is safe, and they're moved somewhere else. And then, but if the Soviets found him, they would have murdered him on the spot. I would have been surprised if they hadn't. So, uh, so that would depend on who found him first. Um, and Japan would look like basically Germany, at least physically. However, the northern Japanese would have it much harder. They would have a much harder life because now we're not dealing like with Germany and so in the Soviets. They were Europeans, and now you're dealing with a whole different race. And the Soviets would definitely want revenge because they didn't like the fact that they were the first European power to lose to an Asian power in 1905. Uh, so they would probably want to have something to do with that, um, and they would just massacre the populace. They'd have the slave labor, of course, but they would just do whatever they pleased up in the northern part of the country. Um, there could have been also even been a Japanese civil war between North and South, just like the Korean War, just like the Vietnam War. It would just be another proxy war, and so there's that, and there's also the idea that because the Soviets were friends with China, they might even allow Chinese troops to come in and have some revenge on Japan for what Japan did in 1937. They would just come in and do the exact same thing. But that's all what if. It's just a theory, so it's really hard to tell what would go on. So that's with the atomic or without the atomic bombs. And also, the Cold War would probably not be cold. It would definitely be hot, with people having these types of armaments and wanting to know how they work. So that's why I don't necessarily think it's a war crime. I understand why people would think so, but it was definitely not. Um, so, and modern Japan would not exist like it does today. So after the war, you have the war crime trials, Tokyo trials, and you got all the war criminals, and you got the different classes, depending on the type of um, atrocities they committed, and uh, so um, you got all these different people, these different